Good afternoon. My name is Leon Anel, and today I'll be presenting my research entitled Psychological Spousal Abuse, Homicide Convictions. When society thinks about domestic violence, the first images that usually come to mind are bruises, broken bones, physical injuries. These visible injuries often become the standard by which abuse is recognized by the criminal justice system. However, many victims experience years of psychological abuse before the physical violence occurs. During that time, victims are manipulated, isolated, intimidated, humiliated, and controlled. Although these forms of abuse leave no visible scars, they often produce devastating psychological consequences. My thesis argues that psychological spousal abuse must be prosecuted as attempted homicide by the criminal justice system because it goes beyond emotional mistreatment, systematically removes victim coping mechanisms, and ultimately drives victims towards self-destruction. Throughout this presentation, I will explain how psychological abuse develops, how it affects victims, why it creates foreseeable risk to human life, and why the criminal justice system should recognize it as conduct that deserves greater legal accountability. Background and historical development. Historically, domestic violence was viewed as a private family matter rather than a criminal issue. For centuries, women had few legal protections within marriage, and abusive behavior often went unchallenged by the legal system. Although laws eventually evolved, particularly with the Violence Against Women Act, criminal justice responses have continued to focus primarily on physical injury. This means that victims suffering severe psychological abuse frequently receive little or no legal protection until physical violence occurs. My research also found that several countries outside the United States have begun recognizing coercive control as criminal conduct, demonstrating that legal systems are capable of addressing psychological abuse before violence escalates. Defining psychological spousal abuse. Psychological spousal abuse differs from physical abuse because it relies upon patterns of control instead of physical force. These behaviors include verbal abuse, humiliation, intimidation, threats, manipulation, isolation, financial control, coercive control. One more important characteristic of psychological abuse is that it develops gradually. Most abusive relationships do not begin with obvious violence. Instead, controlling behaviors often appear caring or protective in the early stages. As trust develops, those behaviors become increasingly controlling until the victim's independence has been significantly reduced. Because the abuse develops slowly, many victims do not recognize the pattern until they have become emotionally or psychologically dependent on the abuser. Psychological abuse removes coping mechanisms. The central argument of my thesis is that psychological abuse systematically destroys the victim's ability to cope. Healthy coping mechanisms often include family support, friendships, employment, hobbies, religious communities, social organizations. Psychological abusers gradually isolate victims from these support systems. At the same time, they destroy the victim's confidence through repeated criticism, humiliation, manipulation, and intimidation. Financial dependence often follows, making it increasingly difficult for victims to leave abusive relationships. By removing these protective factors, the abusive partner gains control, greater control over every aspect of the victim's life. Mental health consequences. Research consistently demonstrates that victims of psychological abuse experience significant mental health consequences. These include depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse, self-harm, suicidal ideation. These conditions do not develop suddenly. They are often the result of prolonged exposure to coercive control. As victims lose confidence, hope, and independence, many begin believing there is no way to escape the abuse. These psychological injuries may continue long after the abusive relationship has ended. Foreseeable risks to human life. One of the most important concepts in my thesis is the legal principle of foreseeability. Within criminal law, individuals are often held responsible for the reasonable, foreseeable consequences of their actions. My research demonstrates that psychological abuse produces consequences that have been repeatedly documented in scholarly literature. Victims frequently experience emotional deterioration, suicidal thoughts, self-harm, and increasing vulnerability to physical violence. As the abusive partner gains greater control and the victim becomes increasingly isolated, the relationship often progresses towards more dangerous and sometimes lethal outcomes. These outcomes are not random. They are foreseeable consequences of prolonged coercive control. Escalation to intimidate partner homicide. Research also demonstrates that psychological abuse frequently precedes intimate partner homicide. Common warning signs include obsessive jealousy, stalking, threats to kill, increasing isolation, previous acts of violence, access to weapons, repeated violations of protective orders. These behaviors are often developed over many years before homicide occurs. This suggests that the criminal justice system has opportunities to intervene much more earlier than it currently does. Waiting until physical violence occurs often means waiting until it is too late. Criminal justice implications. My thesis ultimately argues that psychological spousal abuse should be prosecuted as attempted homicide. This current legal system generally requires evidence of physical injury before criminal prosecution begins. However, psychological abuse produces foreseeable harm that threatens human life. Recognizing severe psychological abuse as attempted homicide would allow earlier intervention, better protection for victims, improved training for criminal justice professionals, increased offender accountability, and potentially fewer intimate partner homicides. Such reform would shift the focus of the criminal justice system for reacting after tragedy occurs to preventing tragedy before it happens. Conclusion. In conclusion, psychological abuse is not simply emotional mistreatment. It is a deliberate and progressive pattern of coercive control that systematically destroys the victim's coping mechanisms, damages mental health, and places victims at substantial risk of self-destruction and lethal violence. Because these outcomes are foreseeable and supported by extensive scholarly research, psychological abuse deserves greater recognition within the criminal justice system. My research concludes that severe psychological spousal abuse should be recognized as conduct capable of constituting attempted homicide because it intentionally creates conditions that place victims' lives in danger. Protecting victims require earlier intervention, stronger legal recognition, or coercive control, and a criminal justice system willing to address psychological abuse before it escalates into irreversible tragedy. Thank you for your time. I welcome any questions.